The pioneering work of Raymond B Cattell. An important figure in the early years of psychometrics was Raymond B Cattell, who was born in England but who spent most of his career in the United States. Cattell did not have a direct influence on Eysenck. Indeed, the two men had quite different approaches to measuring the structure of personality. Because some familiarity of Cattell's trait theory enhances the understanding of Eysenck's three-factor theory, we briefly discuss Cattell's work and compare and contrast it with that of Eysenck. First, Cattell used an inductive method of gathering data, that is, he began with no preconceived bias concerning the number or name of traits or types. In contrast, Eysenck used deductive reasoning to identify three personality factors. That is, he had some preconceived hypothesis in mind before he began gathering data. Second, Cattell used three different media of observation to examine people from as many angles as possible. The three sources of data included a person's life record, L data, derived from observations made by other people. Self-reports, Q data, obtained from questionnaires and other techniques designed to allow people to make subjective descriptions of themselves. And objective tests, T data, which measure performance such as intelligence, speed of responding, and other such activities designed to challenge people's maximum performance. In contrast, each of Eysenck's three bipolar factors is limited to responses on questionnaires. These self-reports confine Eysenck's procedures to personality factors. Third, Cattell divided traits into common traits, shared by many, and unique traits, peculiar to one individual. He also distinguished source traits from trait indicators, or surface traits. Cattell further classified traits into temperament, motivation, and ability. Traits of temperament are concerned with how a person behaves, motivation deals with why one behaves, and ability refers to how far or how fast one can perform. Fourth, Cattell's multifaceted approach yielded 35 primary, or first-order traits, which measure mostly the temperament dimension of personality. Of these factors, 23 characterize the normal population and 12 measure the pathological dimension. The largest and most frequently studied of the normal traits are the 16 personality factors found on Cattell's 16 personality factors questionnaire. By comparison, the Eysenck personality questionnaire yields scores on only 3 personality factors. Fifth, while Cattell was measuring a large number to traits, Eysenck was concentrating on types, or superfactors that make up several interrelated traits. We discuss types and traits in the section titled Hierarchy of Behavior Organization. Basics of Factor Analysis. A comprehensive knowledge of the mathematical operations involved in factor analysis is not essential to an understanding of trait and factor theories of personality, but a general description of this technique should be helpful. To use factor analysis, one begins by making specific observations of many individuals. These observations are then quantified in some manner, for example, height is measured in inches, weight in pounds, aptitude in test scores, job performance by rating scales, and so on. Assume that we have 1,000 such measures on 5,000 people. Our next step is to determine which of these variables, scores, are related to which other variables and to what extent. To do this, we calculate the correlation coefficient between each variable and each of the other 999 scores. A correlation coefficient is a mathematical procedure for expressing the degree of correspondence between two sets of scores. To correlate 1,000 variables with the other 999 scores would involve 499,500 individual correlations, 1,000 multiplied by 999 divided by 2. Results of these calculations would require a table of intercorrelations, or a matrix, with 1,000 rows and 1,000 columns. Some of these correlations would be high and positive, some near zero, and some would be negative. For example, we might observe a high positive correlation between leg length and height, because one is partially a measure of the other. We may also find a positive correlation between a measure of leadership ability and ratings on social poise. This relationship might exist because they are each part of a more basic underlying trait self-confidence. With 1,000 separate variables, our table of intercorrelations would be quite cumbersome. At this point, we turn to factor analysis, which can account for a large number of variables with a smaller number of more basic dimensions. These more basic dimensions can be called traits, that is, factors that represent a cluster of closely related variables. For example, we may find high positive intercorrelations among test scores in algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and calculus. We have now identified a cluster of scores that we might call factor M, which represents mathematical ability. In similar fashion, we can identify a number of other factors, or units of personality derived through factor analysis. The number of factors, of course, will be smaller than the original number of observations. Our next step is to determine the extent to which each individual score contributes to the various factors. Correlations of scores with factors are called factor loadings. For example, if scores for algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and calculus contribute highly to factor M but not to other factors, they will have high factor loadings on M. Factor loadings give us an indication of the purity of the various factors and enable us to interpret their meanings. Traits generated through factor analysis may be either unipolar or bipolar. Unipolar traits are scaled from 0 to some large amount. Height, weight, and intellectual ability are examples of unipolar traits. In contrast, bipolar traits extend from one pole to an opposite pole, with 0 representing a midpoint. Introversion versus extroversion, liberalism versus conservatism, and social ascendancy versus timidity are examples of bipolar traits. In order for mathematically derived factors to have psychological meaning, the axes on which the scores are plotted are usually turned or rotated into a specific mathematical relationship with each other. This rotation can be either orthogonal or oblique, but Eysenck and advocates of the five-factor theory favor the orthogonal rotation. Figure 14.1 shows that orthogonally rotated axes are at right angles to each other. As scores on the x variable increase, scores on the axis may have any value, that is, they are completely unrelated to scores on the x-axis. The oblique method, which was advocated by Cattell, assumes some positive or negative correlation and refers to an angle of less than or more than 90. That is, as scores on the x variable increase, scores on the axis have a tendency also to increase. Note that the correlation is not perfect. Some people may score high on the x variable but relatively low on y and vice versa. A perfect correlation, r equals 1.00, would result in x and y occupying the same line. Psychologically, orthogonal rotation usually results in only a few meaningful traits, whereas oblique methods ordinarily produce a larger number.